History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 6 The Great Acceleration. Chapter 1 Long Term Change. Here, once more, the revolution brought by industrialization has an impact far beyond material life. It is an immensely complicated problem to distinguish how modern civilization, the first so far as we know, which does not have some formal structure of religious belief at its heart, came into being. Perhaps we cannot separate the role of the city in breaking down traditional religious observance from, say, that of science and philosophy in corrupting the belief of the educated. Yet, a new future was visible already in the European industrial population of 1870. Much of it literate, alienated from traditional authority, secular minded, and beginning to be conscious of itself as an entity. This was a different basis for civilization from anything yet seen. This is to anticipate, but legitimately, for it suggests once again how rapid and deep was the impact of industrialization on every side of life. Even the rhythm of life changed. For the whole of earlier history, the economic behavior of most of mankind had been regulated fundamentally by the rhythms of nature. In an agricultural or pastoral economy, they imposed a pattern on the year which dictated both the kind of work which had to be undertaken and the kind which could be. Operating within the framework set by the seasons were the subordinate divisions of light and darkness, fair weather and foul. Tenants lived in great intimacy with their tools, their animals, and the fields in which they won their bread. Even the relatively few town dwellers lived, in large measure, lives shaped by the forces of nature. In Great Britain and France, a bad harvest could still blight the whole economy well after 1850. Yet, by then, many people were already living lives whose rhythms were dictated by quite different pacemakers. Above all, they were set by the means of production and their demands, by the need to keep machines economically employed, by the cheapness or dearness of investment capital, by the availability of labor. The symbol of this was the factory whose machinery set a pattern of work in which accurate timekeeping was essential. Men began to think in quite different way about time as a consequence of their industrial work. As well as imposing new rhythms, industrialism also related the laborer to work in new ways. It is difficult but important to avoid sentimentalizing the past in assessing this. At first sight, the disenchantment of the factory workers with their monotonous routine, with its exclusion of personal involvement, and its background of the sense of working for another's profit, justifies the rhetoric it has inspired. Whether in the form of regret for a craftsman's world that has vanished, or analysis of what has been identified as the alienation of the worker from the product. But the life of the medieval peasant was monotonous too, and much of it was spent working for another's profit. Nor is an iron routine necessarily less painful because it is set by sunset and sunrise instead of an employer, or more agreeably varied by drought and tempest than by commercial slump and boom. Yet, the new disciplines involved a revolutionary transformation of the ways many men and women won their livelihood. However, we may evaluate the results by comparison with what had gone before. A clear example can be found in what soon became notorious as one of the persistent evils of early industrialism its abuse of child labor. A generation of Englishmen, morally braced by abolition of slavery and by the exaltation that accompanied it, was also one intensely aware of the importance of religious training and therefore of anything which might stand between it and the young. and one disposed to be sentimental about children in a way earlier generations had not been. All this helped to create an awareness of this problem, first in the United Kingdom, which perhaps distracted attention from the fact that the brutal exploitation of children in factories was only one part of a total transformation of patterns of employment. About the use of children's labor in itself, there was nothing new. Children had for centuries provided swineherds, bird scarers, gleaners, maids of all work, crossing sweepers, prostitutes, and casual drudges in Europe, and still do in most non European societies. The terrible picture of the lot of unprotected children in Hugo's great novel, Les Miserables, 1862, is a picture of their life in the pre industrial society. The difference made by industrialism was that their exploitation was regularized and given a quite new harshness by the institutional forms of the factory. Whereas the work of children in an agricultural society had perforce been clearly differentiated from that of adults by their inferior strength. There existed in the tending of machines a whole range of activity in which children's labor competed directly with that of adults. In a labor market normally oversupplied, this meant that there were irresistible pressures upon the parent to send the child into the factory to earn a contribution to the family income as soon as possible, sometimes at the age of 5 or 6. The consequences were not only often terrible for the victims but also revolutionary in that the relation of child to society and the structure of the family were blighted. This was one of the senseless agencies of history at its most dreadful. The problems created by such forces were too pressing to remain without attention, and a start was soon made in taming the most obvious evils of industrialism. By 1850, the law of England had already begun to intervene to protect, for example, women and children in mines and factories in all the millennia of the history of agriculturally based economies. It had still been impossible by that date to eradicate slavery even in the Atlantic world. Given the unprecedented scale and speed of social transformation, early industrial Europe should not be blamed without qualification for not acting more quickly to remedy ills whose outlines could only dimly be grasped. Even in the early stage of the English industrialism, when perhaps the social cost was most heavy, it was difficult to cast off the belief that the liberation of the economy from legal interference was essential to the enormous generation of new wealth which was going on. True, it is almost impossible to find economic theorists and publicists of the early industrial period who advocated absolute non interference with the economy. Yet, there was a broad, sustaining current which favored the view that much good would result if the market economy was left to operate without the help or hindrance of politicians and civil servants. One force working this way was the teaching often summed up in the phrase made famous by a group of Frenchmen, laissez faire. Broadly speaking, economists after Adam Smith had said with growing consensus that the production of wealth would be accelerated and therefore the general well being would increase if the use of economic resources followed the natural demands of the market. Another reinforcing trend was individualism, embodied in both the assumption that individuals knew their own business best and the increasing organization of society around the rights and interests of individuals. These were the sources of the long enduring association between industrialism and liberalism. They were deplored by conservatives who regretted a hierarchical agricultural order of mutual obligations and duties, settled ideas, and religious values. Yet liberals who welcomed the new age were by no means taking their stand on a simply negative and selfish base. The Creed of Manchester, as it was called because of the symbolic importance of that city in English industrial and commercial development, was for its leaders much more than a matter of mere self enrichment. A great political battle which for years preoccupied Englishmen in the early 19th century made this clear. Its focus was a campaign for the repeal of what were called the Corn Laws, a tariff system originally imposed to provide protection for the British farmer from imports of cheaper foreign grain. The repealers, whose ideological and political leader was a none too successful businessman, Richard Cobden, argued that much was at stake. To begin with, retention of the duties on grain demonstrated the grip upon the legislative machinery of the agricultural interest, the traditional ruling class, who ought not to be allowed a monopoly of power. Opposed to it were the dynamic forces of the future which sought to liberate the national economy from such distortions in the interest of particular groups. Back came the reply of the anti repealers. The manufacturers were themselves a particular interest who only wanted cheap food imports in order to be able to pay lower wages. If they wanted to help the poor, what about improving the conditions under which they employed women and children in factories? There, the inhumanity of the production process showed a callous disregard for the obligations of privilege which would never have been tolerated in rural England. To this, the repealers responded that cheap food would mean cheaper goods for export. And in this, for someone like Cobden, much more than profit was involved. A worldwide expansion of free trade, untrampled by the interference of mercantilist governments, would lead to international progress, both material and spiritual, he thought. Trade brought peoples together, exchanged and multiplied the blessings of civilization, and increased the power in each country of its progressive forces. On one occasion, Cobden even committed himself to the view that free trade was the expression of the divine will, though even this was not to go as far as the British Council at Canton, who had proclaimed that Jesus Christ is free trade and free trade is Jesus Christ. There was much more to the free trade issue in Great Britain, of which the Corn Law debate was the focus, than a brief summary can do justice. The more it is expounded, the more it becomes clear that industrialism involved creative, positive ideologies which implied intellectual, social, and political challenge to the past. This is why it should not be the subject of simple moral judgments, though both conservative and liberals thought it could be at the time. The same man might resist legislation to protect the workman against long hours while proving himself a model employer, actively supporting educational and political reform and fighting the corruption of the public interest by privileged birth. His opponent might struggle to protect children working in the factories and act as a model squire, a benevolent patriarch to his tenants, while bitterly resisting the extension of the franchise to those not members of the established church or any reduction of the political influence of landlords. It was all very muddled. In the specific issue of the Corn Laws, the outcome was paradoxical too, for a conservative prime minister was in the end convinced by the arguments of the repealers. When he had the opportunity to do so without too obvious an inconsistency, he persuaded the parliament to make the change in 1846. His party contained men who never forgave him, and this great climax of Sir Robert Peel's political career, for which he was to be revered by his liberal opponents once he was safely out of the way, came shortly before he was dismissed from power by his own followers. Only in England was the issue fought out so explicitly and to so clear cut a conclusion. In other countries, paradoxically, The protectionists soon turned out to have the best of it. Only in the middle of the century, a period of expansion and prosperity, especially for the British economy, did free trade ideas get much support outside the United Kingdom, whose prosperity was regarded by believers as evidence of the correctness of their views and even mollified their opponents. Free trade became a British political dogma, untouchable until well into the 20th century. The prestige of British economic leadership helped to give it a brief popularity elsewhere too. The prosperity of the era, in fact, owed as much to other influences as to this ideological triumph, but the belief added to the optimism of economic liberals. Their creed was the culmination of the progressive view of human potential, whose roots lay in Enlightenment ideas. The solid grounds for this optimism can, nowadays, be too easily overlooked. In assessing the impact of industrialism, we labor under the handicap of not having before us the squalor of the past it left behind. For all the poverty and the slums, and the very worst was over by then. The people who lived in the great cities of 1900 consumed more and lived longer than their ancestors. This did not, of course, mean they were either tolerably off by later standards or contented, but they were often and probably for the most part materially better off than their predecessors or most of their contemporaries in the non European world. Amazing as it may seem, they were part of the privileged minority of mankind. Their lengthening lives were the best evidence of it. Chapter 2: Political Change in an Age of Revolution. In the 18th century, the word revolution came to have a new meaning. Traditionally, it meant only a change in the cosmopolitan government and not necessarily a violent one. Though, one reason why the British English Glorious Revolution of 1688 was thought glorious was that it had been non-violent. Englishmen learned to believe. Men could speak of a revolution occurring at a particular court when one minister replaced another. After 1789, this changed. Men came to see that year at the beginning of a new sort of revolution, a real rapture with the past, perhaps characterized by violence, but also by limitless possibilities for radical change, social and political and economic, and began to think too that this new phenomenon might transcend national boundaries and have something universal and general about it. Even those who disagreed very much about the desirability of such a revolution could nonetheless agree that this new sort of revolution was a phenomenon of the politics of their age. It would be misleading to seek to group all the political changes of this period under the rubric of revolution, conceived in such terms as these. But we can usefully speak of an age of revolution for two other reasons. One is that there were indeed within a century or so many more political upheavals than hitherto that could be called revolutions in this extreme sense, even though many of them failed and others brought results far different from those they had led people to expect. In the second place, if we give the term a little more elasticity, and allow it to cover examples of greatly accelerated and fundamental political change, which certainly go beyond the replacement of one set of governors by another. Then there are many less dramatic political changes in these years which are distinctly revolutionary in their effect. The first and most obvious was the dissolution of the First British Empire, whose central episode later became known as the American Revolution. In 1763, British imperial power in North America was at its height. Canada had been taken from the French. The old fear of a Mississippi Valley cordon of French forts enclosing the 13 colonies had been blown away. This might seem to dispose of any grounds for future misgivings. Yet, some prophets had already suggested, even before the French defeat, that their removal might not strengthen but weaken the British grasp on North America. In the British colonies, after all, there were already more colonists than there were subjects in many sovereign states of Europe. Many were neither of English descent nor native English speakers. They had economic interests not necessarily congruent with those of the imperial power. Yet the grip of the British government on them was bound to be slack, simply because of the huge distances which separated London from the colonies. Once the threat from the French and from the Indians whom the French had egged on was gone, the ties of empire might have to be allowed to grow slacker still. Difficulties soon appeared. How the West was to be organized? What relation was it to have to the existing colonies? How were the new Canadian subjects of the Crown to be treated? These problems were given urgency by Indian revolt in the Ohio Valley in 1763 in response to pressure by colonists who saw the West as their proper domain for settlement and trade. The imperial government immediately proclaimed the area west of the Alleghenies closed to settlement. This, as a start, offended many colonials who had looked forward to the exploitation of these regions, and it was followed by further irritation as British administrators negotiated treaties with Indians and worked out arrangements for a garrisoned frontier to protect the colonists and Indians from one another. 10 years followed, during which the dormant potential for American independence matured and came to a head. Grumbles about grievances turned first into resistance, then rebellion. Time after time, colonial political used provocative British legislation to radicalize American politics by making the colonists believe that the practical liberty they already enjoyed was in danger. The pace throughout was set by British initiatives. Paradoxically, Great Britain was ruled at this time by a succession of ministers anxious to carry out reforms in colonial affairs. Their excellent intentions helped to destroy a status quo which had previously proved workable. They thus provide one of the first examples of what was to be a frequent phenomenon of the next few decades, the goading of vested interests into rebellion by well meant but politically ill judged reform. One principle firmly grasped in London was that the Americans ought to pay a proper share of the taxes which contributed to their defense and the common good of the empire. There were two distinct attempts to assure this. The first, in 1764 to 1765, took the form of imposing duties on sugar imported to the colonies and a Stamp Act which was to raise money from the revenue stamps to put on various classes of legal documents. The important thing about these was not the amounts they proposed to raise, nor even the novelty of taxing the internal transactions of the colonies, which was much discussed, but rather that these were, as both English politicians and American taxpayers saw, unilateral acts of legislation by the imperial parliament. The usual way in which colonial affairs were handled and revenue raised had been by haggling with their own assemblies. What was now brought into question was something so far hardly even formulated as a question whether the undoubted legislative sovereignty of the Parliament of the United Kingdom also extended to its colonies. Riots, non importation agreements, and angry protest followed. The unhappy officials who held the stamps were given a bad time. Ominously, representatives of 9 colonies attended a Stamp Act Congress to protest. The Stamp Act was withdrawn. The London government then took a different tact. Its second fiscal initiative imposed external duties on paint, paper, glass, and tea. As these were not internal taxes and the imperial government had always regulated trade, they seemed more promising. But it proved an illusion. Americans were by now being told by their radical politicians that no taxation at all should be levied on them by a legislature in which they were not represented. As George III saw, it was not the crown but Parliament whose power was under attack. There were more riots and boycotts, and one of the first of those influential scuffles which make up so much of the history of decolonization. When the death of possibly five rioters in 1770 was mythologized into a Boston massacre. Once more, the British government retreated. Three of the duties were withdrawn, that on tea remained. Unfortunately, the issue was by now out of hand. It transcended taxation, as the British government saw, and had become one of whether or not the imperial parliament could make laws enforceable in the colonies. As George III put it a little later, we must either master them or totally leave them to themselves. The issue was focused in one place, though it manifested itself throughout the colonies. By 1773, after the destruction of the cargo of tea by radicals, the Boston Tea Party, the crucial question for the British government was, could Massachusetts be governed? There were to be no more retreats. George III, his ministers, and the majority of the House of Commons were agreed on this. A number of coercive acts were passed to bring Boston to heel. The New England radicals were heard all the more sympathetically in the other colonies at this juncture because a humane and sensible measure providing for the future of Canada, the Quebec Act of 1774, stirred up wide feeling. Some disliked the privileged position it gave to Roman Catholicism. It was intended to leave French Canadians as undisturbed as possible in their ways by their change of rulers, while others saw its extension of Canadian boundaries south to the Ohio as another block to expansion in the west. In September the same year, a Continental Congress of delegates from the colonies at Philadelphia severed commercial relations with the United Kingdom and demanded the repeal of much existing legislation, including the Quebec Act. By this time, the recourse to enforce was probably inevitable. The radical colonial politicians had brought out into the open the practical sense of independence already felt by many Americans. But it was inconceivable that any 18th century imperial government could have grasped this. The British government was, in fact, remarkably reluctant to act on its convictions by relying simply on force until disorder and intimidation of the law abiding and moderate colonials had already gone very far. At the same time, it made it clear that it would not willingly bend on the principles of sovereignty. Arms were gathered in Massachusetts. In April 1775, a detachment of British soldiers sent to Lexington to seize some of them fought the first action of the American Revolution. It was not quite the end of the beginning. It took a year more for the feelings of the colonists' leaders to harden into the conviction that only complete independence from Great Britain would rally an effective resistance. The result was the Declaration of Independence of July 1776, and the debate was transferred to the battlefield.